Years ago, when this happened, I was living abroad for my studies. Once my education ended, I found myself returning. I had grown to love the culture and just being there. Now, I've met someone and we're planning to get married this autumn. Life had been going smoothly until last week when something happened that put a huge strain on my relationship. It all started when a friend of mine reached out to me on Skype. He was American, like me, but had come to build a new life in South Korea. Being 5 years older, he had already explored nearly every major attraction in the country and had 2 kids. We were casually chatting when, out of nowhere, he mentioned Narayama Woods. Now, I'm pretty sure most people know what that is. If you don't, go ahead and look it up, I won't be explaining it. Basically, he offered me $500 if I camped out there alone for 2 nights. My fiancée, who was born and raised in South Korea, strongly opposed the idea. She warned me about the horrifying stories of people who entered but never came back, of spirits that followed people home. Things that sounded like urban legends. I told her I wasn't afraid of some so-called haunted forest and agreed to the challenge. On the day I left, she begged me not to go, but I went anyway. I wanted to prove there was nothing to fear. Plus, I really wanted the $500 and maybe a little adventure. I kissed her goodbye and set out. Walking up to the forest, I could feel something unsettling about it. It was beautiful, sure, but also deeply eerie. The density of the trees was beyond anything I had seen before, like a wall blocking out the world. As soon as I stepped in, I felt like I had entered another realm. The sounds of insects and wildlife filled the air, and I could hear faint voices of other visitors somewhere nearby. The temperature dropped noticeably. I wouldn't admit it at the time, but I was nervous. I kept reminding myself it was just a forest and pushed forward along the trails. Eventually, I found a flat, secluded spot to set up camp. By then, it was around 7 p.m. and night was setting in. The first night was rough. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made me flinch. I wasn't familiar with the wildlife here, and the forest's reputation weighed on me. Who else might be out there? The next morning, I woke up groggy, unwilling to leave my tent. In truth, I wanted to leave the forest entirely. I decided to hike down toward the base of Mount Hala to explore a bit. As I made my way through, I took plenty of photos to prove to my friend that I had actually done it. Shots of trees, wildlife, anything interesting. About halfway through my hike, I put my camera away. That's when I heard a woman crying to my left. Curious, I cautiously approached to see if she needed help. When I saw her, she was young, maybe in her 20s. Beside her was an older woman, possibly her mother, holding her tightly. Both were kneeling in front of a body. The sight was heartbreaking. The older woman glanced at me, and for a brief moment we locked eyes. She was holding back tears, struggling but refusing to break down completely. I gave her a small nod as if to say, I understand. It's gonna be okay. Then I walked away. I assumed the person lying before them was a relative, a brother, a father. I didn't look too closely. I didn't want to. As I continued walking, I couldn't shake that image from my mind. I sat down against a tree, lost in thought about my fiancée, my friend, and this whole ridiculous challenge. After about 20 minutes of sitting there, I made my decision. I packed up and left. Let me explain why. I had come to this forest knowing its reputation. I expected a spooky, haunted place, and while it was eerie, I had overlooked what it really was. This was a place where people came after losing all hope. A place where life, our most precious gift, was abandoned. I hadn't looked at it through the eyes of someone like that grieving woman. To me, it had been an attraction, a dare, like something you'd visit for a Halloween scare. That was wrong. That was disrespectful. For months after that, I fell into a deep depression. Witnessing how quickly life could be taken away, by choice or otherwise, was haunting. It made everything feel meaningless. What was the point of love, marriage, family, when it could all be lost in the end? That mindset took a toll on my relationship. I was no longer affectionate, and my fiancée and I argued constantly. We stopped being intimate. It even escalated to a brief physical fight, leading me to storm out of the house. And where did I go? Back to that forest. I stood at its entrance, staring into the darkness between the trees, reliving everything I had seen and everything I had been feeling. I considered stepping inside again, but I knew that if I did, I might not come back out. The thoughts I was having weren't good. They came and went in waves until one thought stood out. I remembered that older woman, how she held back her tears, how she endured. She was strong, and that was what I needed to be. I returned home, broke down in front of my fiancée, and told her everything. Eventually, I sought help. I was put on antidepressants, and luckily, they worked. It's been nearly a year now, and I'm even considering lowering my dosage. I haven't had a depressive episode in a long time, so I think I'll be okay. So yes, I went back. But before you ask, no, I didn't see ghosts. No eerie voices whispered in my ear. Maybe it was because I wasn't searching for them. Maybe because they weren't there. I don't know, and I don't care. The real reason I'm sharing this is to say that if you ever decide to visit this place, know why you're doing it. If you're looking for cheap thrills, stay home. Calling it one of the scariest places to visit is like advertising a cemetery as a carnival ride. I'm sorry if this post doesn't fit the usual horror stories, but I needed to share it because what I saw in that forest was scarier than any ghost or legend. I saw mortality. I saw the pain of those left behind when someone they love is gone. Something I've rarely had to face in my own life. If you want to criticize me for not sharing something spooky, go ahead. But I just needed to get this out. Be mindful of your reasons for visiting Narayama Woods and think twice before you go. I've been working as a park ranger for nearly 5 years now. I don't feel the need to reveal my exact location, so please don't ask where these events happened. With that out of the way, I want to make it clear that I'm not an expert in the supernatural or strange creatures. I can't explain most of what I've seen and experienced, but maybe some of you can. That being said, I'll start with the first strange encounter I had while patrolling the park where I work. We received a call about a possible trespasser. A trespasser is someone who leaves the designated trails and either gets lost or is up to no good. I can't even count how many teenagers think it's cool to sneak into the woods to smoke. Anyway, I responded to the call and started following the ranger paths to track down whoever it was. The description given to me was vague, tall, and thin. Not much to go on, but it was something. I was nearing the end of a particular trail when I heard something to the east of me. I turned in that direction and caught a quick glimpse of movement before ducking behind a tree. I called out, "Hey, this area is restricted to park staff only." There was no response and no one came forward, so I started moving closer. When I reached the tree where I had seen the figure disappear, I was stunned. There was no one there. In the woods, it's nearly impossible to move silently, yet I hadn't heard a single sound. I looked around but found no sign of anyone. I radioed my supervisor and let him know what had happened. He told me to do another sweep of the area and report back if I found anything. After my second patrol, I still found nothing, so I reported back as instructed. Then he asked me what color I had seen. I told him it looked like someone wearing a red plaid shirt and blue jeans. He chuckled and said, "Ah, that's probably Danny." I was confused. Who's Danny? Does he not get in trouble? Kind of hard to punish a ghost. I gave him a skeptical look, and he explained that Danny had been a teenager attacked by a bear in these woods nearly 15 years ago. He never really left. Since then, I've seen Danny a handful of times. I've also spotted other strange figures now and then. One of the most memorable encounters happened when I was leading a guided tour of the park's campgrounds. A small group of visitors was with me when a woman raised her hand and asked, "Are we allowed over by the river?" She pointed toward the bank, where I saw a woman dressed in a long white gown. "Yes, but we require anyone who can't swim or isn't a legal adult to wear a life jacket. You also can't swim in it, since the current is too strong. But life jackets are a safety precaution," I explained. Then I called out to the woman by the water, "Ma'am, do you mind joining the group up here? It's not safe down there." She slowly turned her head to face me, and when she did, I felt all the blood drain from my face. She had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets. A few people in the group gasped, and some children clung to their parents in fear. When I glanced at the tour group, they were all looking at me for an explanation, but I had none. When I looked back at the woman, she had vanished. We finished the tour, but an uneasy silence lingered over the group. Whenever people find out where I work, they always ask if I believe in Bigfoot. My short answer is no, I don't. But my longer answer is that there are far more terrifying things in the woods than Bigfoot. Here's a story about one of them. This will also be my last story, as it might give too much away about my location. I don't want people coming here just because of these stories. The real reason to visit should be to enjoy nature and all it has to offer. With that said, I'll get to the point. I was doing another patrol when something ran in front of my vehicle. Well, technically, it's just a golf cart. Thinking I had hit a small deer or something similar, I stopped and radioed the head ranger. When he asked for a description, I struggled to find the right words. The creature was about the size of a large dog, maybe like a Labrador, but completely black with a sleek, almost glossy coat. Its body shape was somewhat canine, but there were no ears, no indication that it had any at all. It also lacked a snout. I don't mean it had a short snout like a pug or bulldog. I mean there was none. The face was flat and sloped down to two small slits where the nose should have been. The head ranger arrived shortly after I radioed in. When he saw the creature, he was just as puzzled as I was. We called in the wildlife specialists, who took it with them for further examination. However, some campers had taken photos of it, and those pictures were submitted to the local newspaper. They ran a small article on it, but luckily it never made it to TV. As far as I know, there haven't been any updates on what it was. I hope you've enjoyed my stories, and maybe you even have some of your own to share. Depending on the response, I might consider telling a few more. But for now, I think I'll keep them to myself. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house since both my parents had jobs that required them to travel frequently. Because of this, I was often dropped off there. It wasn't as bad as some kids might think. This was back in the days of slow internet, so not having Wi-Fi wasn't even a concern. Kids like me spent a lot of time playing outside. Shocking, I know. This particular memory takes place when I was about 8 years old, just before Christmas. My grandparents let me open one present early, without my parents knowing, of course. I still remember what it was and how I felt. It was a brand new pair of binoculars. I had a deep love for birdwatching back then, and I still do, though I had much more free time as a kid. My grandpa looked at me and said, "I'll let you go out into the woods to look for animals, but don't go past the brook." Being 8, I nodded in agreement, but the warning didn't really stick. The forest behind my grandpa's house was huge, and he owned all of it. My dad once mentioned it was around 10 acres. As a kid, I convinced myself that I had explored every inch of it. Funny how a child's imagination works. But that day, my imagination wasn't running wild. What I saw was real, and I knew it. Judging by how my grandparents reacted, they knew it too. I had been in the woods for about 10 minutes, walking straight ahead while looking for birds through my binoculars. I spotted a few blue jays and sparrows, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Then I came across the brook. It was frozen solid, but I still found myself wondering about the other side. Why wasn't I allowed over there? Of course, I knew the real reason. It was for my safety. Once past the brook, the house was no longer visible, and I'd be too far away to hear my grandparents calling. But in my young mind, I thought that crossing was the only way to find the rare birds I wanted to see. I glanced back at the house a few times, debating what to do, and decided to follow the rules. But then I heard something from the other side. It was a man's voice. It wasn't frightening. Actually, it was warm and inviting, like a storyteller from a bedtime audiobook. It grabbed my attention, and before I knew it, I had jumped over the frozen brook and ventured deeper into the trees. The voice didn't return for quite some time, and I wasn't seeing any new birds either. I started to think I had made a mistake. I decided to do one last slow turn with my binoculars before heading back. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I'd get in trouble if I stayed out too long. As I lifted the binoculars to my eyes for one final scan, I saw him. It wasn't a bird, it was a man. He stood tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, and carried a briefcase. Given how strong my binoculars were, he was probably less than half a mile away. He wasn't moving, just standing there. The longer I watched, the more wrong it felt. Why would someone in formal business attire be in the middle of the woods during December? I was so focused that I didn't hear my grandpa approaching. Suddenly, he grabbed me and carried me all the way back to the house, scolding me the whole way. Once inside, he sat me down on the couch and questioned me about what I had seen that made me ignore his warning. Through my sniffles and wiping my eyes, I could only say, "I heard a man out there." His entire expression changed, and I remember hearing him gasp softly. He knelt beside me and asked in a near whisper, "What did he say?" He just said, "Hey," and then he was gone. I didn't see him until I crossed the brook. His voice barely audible. My grandfather asked, "What did he look like?" He had a suit and a briefcase. I couldn't see his face. My grandpa exchanged a glance with my grandma before turning back to me. No, we're not mad, kiddo. Just worried about you." It wasn't until years later that I found out the truth. I was 18 and my grandpa's health was failing. Not critically, but he was quite sick. We were visiting him in the hospital when my parents stepped out to grab food. That's when he told me about the man in the woods. Apparently, long ago, the land had been a burial site before it became overgrown with trees and vines. That man was a spirit known as the gravedigger. According to my grandpa, he had been a businessman, hence the briefcase, but he suffered a heart attack during his wife's funeral. Now, his spirit wandered the forest, searching for her grave. It was a sad story, but the reason my grandpa had been so alarmed that day was far worse. Legend said that if the gravedigger ever noticed you, if you ever met his gaze, you'd be cursed to fall ill and eventually die from heart failure, just like he had. I don't know how much of that I believe, but I do know one thing. I'm glad I never saw his face. His back was turned to me the entire time. My grandmother eventually passed away, though not from heart failure if you're wondering. I've carried the story with me ever since. I tell it to everyone I can, and when I visit my grandparents' old house, I always make sure to warn any kids nearby, never cross the brook. I don't really know how to begin this, so I guess I'll just say it. I saw something in the woods. It wasn't a bear, and it definitely wasn't some mythical creature like Bigfoot. That kind of thing is nonsense, and besides, there are things I'll mention later that completely disprove those theories. So, if you're curious, keep listening. I was hiking along an old trail just outside a small town in Missouri when I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite a little off the path. Normally, I'd leave something like that alone and let the proper people take care of it. I didn't want to be accused of messing with someone's belongings. But this was different. It wasn't just left behind, it was completely wrecked. It looked like someone had been attacked. The tent was ripped from the ground and flipped over. Food was scattered everywhere, and there were still burning embers from a fire spread around the site. That was what made me walk over. I didn't want a stray breeze to catch a spark and set the whole forest ablaze. I stepped in carefully, making sure to stomp out all the embers. Then, I looked around the area to see if anyone was nearby, maybe someone who had been staying here. I walked into the trees, calling out in case someone needed help. That was my mistake. I had only gone about 20 feet in when I heard it, a deep, guttural growl coming from the woods. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't quite like a large dog, but it wasn't like a bear's roar either. It was something in between, something I couldn't place. I hesitated, debating whether I should turn back. But at the same time, if someone had been out there and gone through whatever wrecked that campsite, I wanted to help. I kept moving forward, trying to listen, but the sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was impossible to pinpoint. Eventually, I reasoned that whoever had been camping must have left their stuff behind, and some wild animal had come through looking for food. But that didn't explain everything. Most animals are afraid of fire, so how had the embers been scattered as if someone had kicked them around? That was when I decided this was getting too unsettling. I turned back toward the campsite, and though I didn't realize it at the time, the growling had stopped. It wasn't until I made it back that I heard it again, and finally saw what had been making the sound. I ducked behind the tree-line, hoping whatever it was wouldn't see me. It was huge. Imagine a bear standing upright, but completely hairless. That was why I knew it couldn't be a bear. I'm pretty sure they don't just shed all their fur like that. On top of that, this thing was walking, though its movements were awkward and unsteady. It wandered through the wrecked campsite, sniffing around as if looking for more food. When it didn't find anything, it slowly lumbered back into the trees. I left after that and went straight home. Later, I did some research, but I couldn't find anything that matched what I had seen. If anyone knows what this could have been, I'd really appreciate the help. I'm pulling from memory here, but I remember it being about the size of a bear. It was definitely an animal. There was no way it was human. It wasn't wearing clothes, but I didn't see any features that made it look human either. It had small, round ears on top of its head and a long snout. I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I never tried asking about it before, mostly because I was afraid of being laughed at. Please, does anyone know what that thing was? When I was 9, my parents signed me up for the Scouts. Now, despite what you're about to hear, I still think it was one of the best experiences I ever had. I loved exploring the outdoors, learning survival skills, and all that fun stuff. Since a big part of our activities took place in the woods and involved wildlife, you'd expect me to have at least one eerie story. Well, I can tell you that every scout probably has one, and this is mine. By the time this happened, I had been in the Scouts for about a year. We were working on some sort of lesson about leaves. I don't remember exactly what it was, but that's not really important. Once we finished, we were split into pairs and told to find the biggest leaf we could. It might sound silly, but honestly, it was pretty fun. We had clear instructions not to go beyond the scout leader's line of sight. But the kid I was paired with wasn't the type to follow rules. Every time the scout leader glanced away, he checked over his shoulder, then took off into the trees the moment they weren't looking. Now, we had been trained that if we ever got separated from our partner, we should blow the emergency whistle we were given. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about that. Instead, I did something foolish. I chased after him, yelling, "We're not supposed to go out here." He just kept running. Eventually, he stopped and turned back to me. He was older than me by a couple of years, probably around 11, so when I saw the cigarette in his mouth, I wasn't too shocked. My parents smoked too, so I figured it was just something older people did. "We need to go back," I told him. "I can't see the scout leader anymore." He just chuckled and took a drag from the cigarette. "Fine," I said. "I'll just call them over." I reached for my whistle, but before I could use it, he smacked it right out of my hand. "You better not get me in trouble, or I'll beat you up." I took that threat seriously. I wasn't a big kid, and since he was older, I figured he was stronger. He laughed about it for a few seconds, until his face suddenly went pale. At first, I thought the scout leader had caught us, but it was so much worse. He dropped his cigarette and bolted back toward camp without saying a word. I ran over and stomped it out before turning to follow him. That's when I saw it. For lack of a better word, it was a monster. It was massive, covered in thick, dirty fur, and it stank like rotting flesh. The hair on its face and hands was clumped together with what I could only assume was dried blood. I was so terrified I actually wet myself right then and there. The thing wasn't moving, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out if it would. Pushing aside every ounce of logic, I scrambled to grab the whistle off the ground. The second my fingers closed around it, I blew into it as hard as I could. I was lucky that thing was slow. If it had been just a little faster, it could have torn me apart. The sharp sound of the whistle made the creature let out a deep, awful howl before it turned and rushed off into the forest. Moments later, one of the scout leaders scooped me up and carried me back to camp. We got a long, serious lecture that night about staying safe in the wilderness. One thing that stuck with me was when the leader said, "There are things out here that can hurt you." It seemed like a harsh thing to say to a kid, but deep down I knew he was right. We kept going into those woods after that, but I never saw anything like that again.